In this lesson, I'm going to be showing you how we can create a tool to control the position of the sun. And it's a nice little tool you can use with more of a graphical representation of the position of the sun. And it can be extremely helpful rather than using some of the traditional methods for modifying the sun. So we're going to start out by just loading in a sphere into our scene. And this sphere is going to represent basically our planet. But other than that, it really doesn't have any use within the tool other than just a nice little visual display. So I'm going to select our sphere and right-click within our Layers panel and go all the way down to Rename. And we are going to call this Planet. And I'm also going to create a new layer for this, which we can do by going down to the lower left of our Layers panel and just selecting this icon where we can create a new layer. And I'm going to call this layer, just right mouse click, and actually we'll just go ahead and click on it in order to highlight it and rename it. And I'm going to call this Sun Reference. And that way we can keep this separate from the rest of our scene. So now we have our planet sphere, which I am going to open the material editor for and make sure that we give it a new material name. Call it planet, and I'm going to edit the color map and just make it sort of a green color. I'm also going to go into the Effects tab and turn up the Luminous and turn off Cast and Receive Shadows. I'm also going to turn off Indirect Lighting and Anti-Aliasing and make sure that we exclude it and ignore indirect lighting on this object. Because this is really just for the OpenGL display and it's not something we would want to render in the scene. And now I am going to add in another sphere. And if, depending on the settings you have selected, if you click on the previous object or the planet object and create a new sphere, it will create it in the exact same place. And in this case, the exact same default size. Well, I'm going to select our size gizmo. We're going to move over to the ruler tab. And if we take a look at our size, we can see that it is 6 meters. Well, I'm going to be changing this to 1 meter on all of our axes. And also take a look at the position and see exactly where this object is located. Now what we want to do is place this around the edge of our object, but we kind of need some exact measurements. So we know that our planet object is 6 meters. And then our new sphere that we just created, which we'll be renaming Sun in just a sec, we know that that is 1 meter. So all we have to do is take 6.5 meters, and that will be our Z position if you have Z as your up axis. So we can just type in 6.5, and now it's basically resting on our object. You could also switch to the Move tool and just move it upward and drop the object, but you might not get an exact number. You can see that it's a little bit off, so sometimes it's a little easier just to type that in. Now what we also want to do is adjust the pivot point of this sphere. We want it to rotate basically within the center of our planet object, and since that's 6 meters, we know that our Z for our pivot, which is currently set to 6.5, we can go ahead and set that to 3. So now we're going to have that in the center of our sphere and our planet sphere. And I'm going to go ahead and rename the new sphere we just created to Sun. And we also want to open up the material for this, rename it Sun, and we can just go ahead and change our color map and give it more of a yellowish orange color. Still with those luminous settings that we had, because it was given the same material as our planet, and all we really had to do was change the name and the color, so our other settings are still there. If we go back to the material editor, we can see that this is not going to cast shadows or receive shadows from any objects, and it's also not going to affect our indirect lighting in the scene. And we can go ahead and ignore indirect lighting on the object itself, just to make sure that it has no chance of interfering with the scene. So now we have our sun object, and to really take a look at what this pivot has done, we can go ahead and switch to the rotate gizmo, which is the middle one on the right. And if you need to make your gizmo a little bit larger, you can use the number pad and use the plus and minus in order to increase and decrease the size of that gizmo. So now that we're in the move mode, I also have it set to global, which is going to be good for this type of tool. And as you can see, if we just click in the center and start rotating our object around, we can see the sun moving around and moving from that pivot point in the center of our object. So if we take a look in the side view, we can see that pivot showing up in the center. What we can also do is make sure that our show pivot is turned on, and then when we're really looking at the object, rotating it around, we should be able to see that pivot in the center, and we can also see a line going from the object to the center of the planet where our pivot is located, although that is currently showing up as sort of a green color, and that is the color of our planet. So you may not be able to see that, but there is a line showing up between those two positions. So go ahead and just undo that move that we had made on the sun. And one thing to note about the default sunlight in the default scene, which is what I'm currently using, is that the position of the sun isn't perfect. If we go ahead and hit F4 on the keyboard to open up the atmosphere editor, we can go up to atmosphere and atmosphere editor from the top menu. We're going to take a look at the sun tab. Now what we should be able to do is type in a value of 90 for our pitch, and that should make our sun directly in the center of the sky if we had default settings, or just basic unedited settings. But we can see that it's currently pointing at the camera, so we will need to make sure that point at camera is off for this object. And if we go back into the atmosphere editor and now adjust the azimuth, you can see that there's no way to really get this object to be directly in the top of the sky, which normally you wouldn't want it to be. But in this case, we will want to have it positioned in a specific manner. So I'm going to select our sunlight, and if we go over to the ruler tab and select the rotation, what we're going to see is the roll, and that is what it's currently affecting our inability to straighten the object out. So if I turn our roll down to 0, we'll see our sun pointing down into the scene. And now all we have to do is select that sunlight once again. We're going to go to move this time, and we just want to set our X and our Y to 0. And that's going to position it directly above the planet object we just made and the sun object. And then we can take our sun and go ahead and position on the Z around 7.5. Let me go ahead and take a look at that. Of course, our sun is typically linked directly to our camera. So sometimes you can't always find the sun, which is what's so nice about this tool. And it looks like I modified our sun object rather than our sunlight. So go ahead and reset those position values. And we can bring that up. Let's go ahead and bring it up to 11 meters on the Z, if your Z is the up axis. So if you really want, and in this case I'm going to name this object, the one we currently have called sun, to sun reference. And that way I don't confuse it with our actual sunlight. And before we do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and hit F4 again to open up the atmosphere editor, and we can take a look at our pitch and azimuth. And I'm going to go ahead and change the azimuth to 90 and click OK. And we can see that's really not going to affect the sun at all because our pitch is set to 90 degrees, which is going to be perfectly centered in the top of our sky. But now with our sunlight selected, I'm going to go ahead and drag this down into our sun reference layer. You could also keep it outside of the layer, in the main layer if you want to. Its position in the layers really doesn't matter too much, but sometimes taking main objects like the ground plane and cameras and sunlights out of the main layer can sometimes cause some issues. Not very frequently, but it will happen sometimes where your layers will get a little mixed up. So we're going to go ahead and just bring it in there. This is something very simple, so it shouldn't cause any issues whatsoever. And in our last tab, which we have is our motion tab, tracking, I am going to link our sunlight to our sun reference. And now we can select our sun reference object, and if we want we can scale down those gizmos or increase the size. And now with the rotate mode selected with our gizmo, and we're just working in global right now, but since our pivot position is basically in the same place and we haven't modified this object, global and local shouldn't matter at this point. But what we can do is now just click and rotate around this object in order to position our sun. And it gives us a nice visual reference that can be something that's constant, because as I start to move the camera in and out, we're going to see the sun kind of jumping around. And I actually have an option on where it's going to keep the sun, lights, and cameras the same size. If we go ahead and take a look at File and Options, we can take a look at one of those settings. And we'll just go ahead and select the display options. And we can see we have fixed camera and light sizes in view. And that will keep our objects the exact same size, although zooming in and out usually still repositions them. But this isn't a big deal. It doesn't really matter where our camera or light ends up, because we can still control the sun entirely with this object, and with the reference we'll always know exactly where it's at. So this is a layer you can hide if needed. And we can see that the sunlight is still active in our scene, even though the visual is hidden. And we can also right mouse click, and it looks like we cannot hide this from the render. So we'll have to go ahead and select the individual objects, right mouse click, hide those from the render, and now those won't show up at all. We can go ahead and turn that back on. So now we can view the layer and the objects in it, but we still have hide from render turned on. So you'll be able to load up this layer in any scene. You can save these objects out. The easiest way would be really to create a new default scene with this new layer that you can use. And you can do that by going to File and Options. And if we go to General Preferences, you can click Set Default Scene. And what that's going to do is take whatever scene you are currently working on, the state it's in, and make that the scene that loads every time you open up View. They can be really useful if you make a lot of changes to different aspects of the scene immediately every time you open the program, and that way you can really create that default scene and modify that. And you can of course customize this even more if you want to. One thing you can do that is very helpful once you start reaching the horizon point is you can either take this entire layer and move it down so that it's intersecting with the center of your sphere along with the ground plane. Or you can go ahead and just create an object to represent basically the equator, and just go ahead and create a cylinder for that. You could also use a torus, that would work. But I'm going to select our position, make sure I set that to 0 on all of our axes for the moment. And I'm going to change to our size mode and just set our X and Y to 7 meters and our Z axis to 0.5 meters. We could actually go ahead and bring that down a little bit further. We'll go ahead and do 0.25. And that way we're getting 25 centimeters. And that can make it a little bit easier. We'll go back to our position, and now we can set our Z to 3 meters, which is going to be the center of our planet object. So now we have a new object that we will need to rename and set a material for. And I'm going to call this material Horizon and change its color to a red. And we also want to make sure that we name this Horizon, or you can name it Equator. I'm going to right mouse click, hide it from the render, and that way we just see it in our OpenGL view. We can select our sun reference, go back to the rotate, and I'm going to go ahead and increase our gizmo size with the plus and minus keys on the number pad. And now we can rotate that around, and one reason I like to keep the sun reference object right up against our planet object is because it's a lot easier to see the exact point in the sky where it's at, especially when it starts to reach the point where it's at the horizon. So if we want to position the sun so we can see it, we can go ahead and just move that forward, go ahead and bring that down, and now we can see that sun starting to rise. Oh, now I went ahead and actually selected our planet, so we'll go back to our sun reference and just select that to modify this. And we could also use our control handles to restrict to a specific axis. And it's just a really nice way to be able to control your sun, other than just numerically, a nice little visual representation of where the sun is located in the scene. Because sometimes you can have trouble finding it, especially if you're working in the main camera view a lot and not really switching out to the 4 views, which is probably the easiest way to find the sun. And if we open up the atmosphere editor, we can take a look at the azimuth and the pitch and see that they have been adjusted accordingly to the position we've placed with our objects. So if you want to know the exact value so you can save it out, write it down, use it again, if you're not saving out the atmosphere, you'll be able to adjust this object, position it, And then when you open up the atmosphere editor, get the exact degree of where it is in the sky. So that's really helpful. And then you can adjust basically the tilt of the Earth by adjusting the roll. You could also go back to the sunlight itself and adjust the roll directly on there. But when these are linked, you really don't want to mess around with that too much. It's much better to create another reference object to represent different altitudes or exactly where you're positioned on the planet. And if you wanted to create an object that's a little more elaborate, you could go ahead and, of course, add more to it, adding different degree markers or just sprucing up the way the object looks itself. You could map a texture map to the planet and the sun, make them look a little more realistic. It really depends on what you want to do with it. To make this an even more useful tool, what we do is connect it to the camera so that it always shows up in the same position in the main camera view. And that way it's always connected to our camera and within range. Otherwise we're just going to run into the same problem that we normally would have, which is where is the sun reference object rather than looking for the sun. So we just need to make a couple modifications in order to set this up. And what I want to do first is take our sun reference object, which we have moved at the moment, go to our ruler tab and just make sure we set our rotation settings all the way down to 0 for everything, and that way we're back to our basically default state for this tool. Now what we need to decide is where do we want our object or our tool in the scene? Where do we want it to show up in the camera? Keep in mind that you can always turn it off at any time just by closing out the layer and hiding it by clicking on the eye, clicking it twice because we have it locked, which gives us a nice transparent view. Then we can also turn that on. Before I go ahead and change our links, I am going to select our planet, go ahead and open up the material for it, and if we go to the Transparency tab and just give it a little bit of transparency, that'll show up in the OpenGL view, which will allow us to rotate around our sun reference object and see it behind the object. That's going to be extremely useful, because otherwise you won't know where the sun is on the other side of the object if you happen to move the sun over there. So now we want to start at the top with the sun reference object within our sun reference layer. We're going to go to our last tab and just have that open. What we want to do now is just position our camera where we would like to have our object and where we would like it to show up. And I'm going to have it in the lower left corner. You could also have it positioned in the center of the screen. And that's really just personal preference. So I'm going to stick with it down in the lower left corner. That way we can always see the horizon. If I was to move it up into the sky, where we would have more negative space, it would be difficult to see exactly where the sun is because of where the horizon is located. You could also go ahead and add some transparency to the horizon material if needed. So we're going to go back up to the tab, our linking tab, and with our sun reference object selected, we want to link this to our planet. And for our options, we have the ability to constrain to certain orientations, whether or not we wanted to link it to our position or rotation, whether or not we want the objects to be joined together and move together. And for this object, we want to turn off rotation because the way this is going to be set up, we don't want the sun reference object rotating and moving around our planet as we move the camera around. That can cause a lot of problems. Basically, the sun would stay in the same position no matter where we move the camera, and it would basically be the same as linking it directly to the camera so that the sun is almost always pointing at the camera or in that same position. So that will move around as you rotate the camera. So that's not something we want. So we want to make sure we turn off the rotation. I'm also going to turn off size. You can leave that on if you want. That way you'd be able to size up these objects all together. But I'm not really going to be doing that. This is just a visual reference. It doesn't really need to have that size option, because we could just move it closer to the camera if needed. And we don't really have to worry about rendering it, so that's not something we really need to be concerned with. So now we can move on to our planet object, which is currently not linked to anything. And we're going to go ahead and link this to our main camera. And we want to select pretty much everything except turn off size once again. And now that whole planet object will be rotating around, so its axis will change. Its rotation settings will not be fixed. So as we move around, we will see that object rotating, but it will not affect our sun reference, which is going to be really nice. So now we can move on to the sunlight. And basically just the same thing, just uncheck size. And now we want to move on to horizon. What we want to do is link this to our planet object so that it moves along with it, stays in the same place as the other objects as we move the camera around. But we do want to make sure that we're turning off size. And once again, we want to turn off the rotation, because if we do not turn off rotation, then the horizon is going to end up moving on us, and we don't want that. It'll be turning around with some of these different axes. And first, let's go ahead and just take a look at the link, and then we can take a look at some of the problems that can happen. But now if I move our camera, we can see the reference object is staying in the same place. I can rotate around the scene, and we're seeing that the sun is staying in the same place and not rotating with the camera. There is one thing you will need to be careful with this technique, and that is as we start to move around, we can see this penetrating other objects, and that's not really the biggest deal. The main problem is the camera intersecting with the ground plane, because, of course, with some of our settings, we do have a restriction to go underneath the ground plane. And go to File, Options, select the Display Options, and you can see under View Options we have a stop camera going below clipping plane, which would be the ground or water, basically whichever infinite plane you have loaded in. So I'm going to uncheck that, and that way we can go underneath the ground if needed without kind of screwing up our object, because if we were to go ahead and rotate and then hit the ground, that could move around our object and possibly mess it up. So now we can select the sun reference and go ahead and rotate that around. So let's go ahead and give ourselves more of a sunrise or sunset. And we can see that showing up in the preview. And now we can move around the object and see exactly where the sun is in relation to our viewport and our camera position, no matter where we go in the scene. So this is probably the best way to use this object, because it allows us to really bring it with us and not have to search for it every time we want to use it. So these little gizmos are really nice when you're setting up your scenes and actively editing them. And now I just want to go back to that horizon object. We'll just use that to show this rotation. So if I go ahead and turn on rotation for the horizon, we can go ahead and move around the object, and there's a little bit of an OpenGL delay, but once it refreshes, we can see it sort of glitching and then moving our horizon, so we do not want that. And basically, it's making it stay in a fixed position in relation to where the camera is. So if you just go back and uncheck rotation, you won't have to worry about that. Now back to the planet object, which we do have rotation enabled for. If we go ahead and start moving around, we can see that that is fixed to our camera. If we go ahead and turn off rotation and start moving around, then we're no longer able to follow that object with the camera, and it will no longer link to it. So even though its axis is getting kind of screwed up, it really doesn't matter unless you're using it for the wireframe for a specific reference, but you can just create a new object to represent your pitch or anything you want to set up with the sun. And also keep in mind that you have the gizmos available. Now there's another thing you need to keep in mind. I'm going to go back and select our sun reference, and I am going to rotate this around. Now if you're going to use the handles to modify our sun, we do need to make sure that we have the parent mode on, or the global mode. I'm going to go ahead and we can move this around, and we can see that rotating correctly along the pivot. But let's go ahead and switch this to local, and if I start to rotate, what's going to happen is the sphere is going to stay in the exact same place, and it's not going to move around the planet object. So it is really important that when you're using the handles that you have local set, we can still select from the center, move that around, and not worry about any sort of interference. Global works the same way as our parent does, except that, of course, the coordinates are linked to the global coordinate system rather than the objects. And then you can also use the view method for the camera view to rotate around the object. So basically just stay clear from the local if you're going to be modifying the object. Unless you want to use the sun reference object as a sort of a pointer of the position your scene is located on the planet. And that way what you could do is take the sun object, and let's go ahead and do this really quick. We'll just go ahead and rotate the sun to angle about where it would direct towards the Earth. And then when we move around and move our sun reference object, we're basically just changing our position on the planet, and then we can rotate with the parent mode at that point in order to change the sun's position. That can get a little confusing, and you may want to link the horizon to that object if you're going to be doing it that way. But just this basic setting seems to work pretty well. And we can just go ahead and stick with the parent mode and create some pretty neat looking scenes and always have that nice little link. And if you do want to move its position, let's say you're not happy with it, over here in the lower left hand part of our viewport, what we want to do is select our main object, the one that is linking to our camera, which in this case is our planet object. And we are going to go to the move gizmo, and we can just move this to wherever we want it. But you will have to use the move gizmo. You will not be able to position the camera closer because, of course, as we move our camera, we are moving the object. So if you want to switch that to the view mode, you could bring it much closer to the camera, and we can center it in our scene. And that way we can always have this kind of pop up whenever we're working on something, and then turn it off when we're not using it. And if you end up running into any problems setting this up, you just want to make sure that if you go to your sunlight and the first tab, that it you do not have point at camera turned on. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and it's something you want to have unchecked for this specific tool. And most issues you'll run into when you're linking the sun to other objects, and especially to the camera, you usually have to do with that setting. Or, of course, the other settings that we have, like position, rotation, join, and also the size option. And that's pretty much it for this tool. I hope you find it useful, and that you might use this technique to create other types of tools to control certain aspects of view.